Hey everyone, and welcome to RUBIN'S Mind Lab, where we break down the latest research into what it really means. Ever wondered how your inner thoughts are actually made? Like that little voice in your head, what is it really doing? That is what today's paper dives into. This is that internal monologue we all have. It is super important for things like reading, planning, even remembering. But how does it actually create that feeling of hearing words in your head? Scientists think it might be like a copy of the instructions your brain sends to your mouth to speak, but without actually moving your mouth, they call this a corollary discharge. This is like your brain predicting what it is going to say and how it is going to sound. So, in a previous study, a researcher named Scott did something really clever. They used something called the Mann effect. Imagine you hear a sound that is a bit blurry. It could be heard as da or ga. What comes before it can actually change how you hear it. If you hear r before the blurry sound, you are more likely to hear da. If you hear al before it, you are more likely to hear ga. This is the Mann effect. Scott found that when people silently mouthed a word that matched the sound before it, it was like their brain was so busy simulating that speech act that it didn't pay as much attention to the external sound. This reduced the Mann effect. It suggested that the brain was using this corollary discharge. This predicted sensory feedback for silent speech. But here is the twist. Scott tested silent speech where you move your mouth but don't make a sound. Our researchers Delem and her team want to know if the same thing happens with inner speech where you don't move your mouth at all. It is purely in your head. This is a direct replication and an extension of Scott's groundbreaking work. So how did they test this? They created a study with 5 different tasks. In one task called hearing, participants just listened to the R or al sounds and then judged the blurry da or ga sound. This was their baseline to see the normal Mann effect. Then they had silent matching and silent contrasting tasks. Similar to Scott's original study, in silent matching, participants silently mouthed the same sound they heard, like saying R silently while hearing R. In silent contrasting, they silently mouthed the opposite sound, like saying R silently while hearing all. The big new part were the inner speech tasks, inner matching, and inner contrasting. Here, participants were asked to think the word R or al in their minds with absolutely no mouth movement. They had to really focus on the imagined sound and feeling. They also had to do this in sync with the sounds they heard. The sounds they used were carefully chosen. They had recordings of a male voice saying R and al. Then they created a whole range of sounds that smoothly went from da to ga. Before the experiment, each person had a quick test to find the exact point on this da-ga sound line, where it sounded equally like da and ga for them. This helped make sure the experiment was sensitive to their perception. Each trial was structured very carefully. Participants would hear a context sound, and then, following a visual cue, they would either silently mouth or mentally say the syllable, trying to match or contrast with the sound they heard. Exactly a tiny fraction of a second later, they'd hear one of those day, ga sounds and had to quickly press a key to say if they heard da or ga. Between these sets of trials, participants were asked to rate how vivid their inner speech and auditory imagery was. Scroll hypotheses see, namely, the researchers had 3 main predictions. First, they expected the Mann effect, that change in perception, to be strongest when people were just listening the hearing task. This was their baseline. Second, they predicted that the Mann effect would be weaker in the silent speech tasks they replicated from Scott, especially when the silent speech matched the heard sound. This was to confirm they were on the right track. And the most important hypothesis, they predicted that the Mann effect would also be reduced during inner speech, particularly when the imagined speech matched the heard sound. If this happened, it would strongly suggest that our inner voice, our inner speech, really does rely on that brain mechanism, the corollary discharge, to create its sensory content. To analyze their results, they used powerful statistical tools, specifically Bayesian multi-level logistic regression models. Think of it like this. They weren't just looking at averages. They were building detailed models that accounted for each person's unique way of hearing and thinking, and how their responses changed across different tasks. They were also looking at Bayes factors, which are like a way to measure just how much the evidence supports one idea over another. They wanted to be really sure of their findings. They aimed to recruit a good number of participants, around 60, to make sure they had enough statistical power. This means they wanted to be very confident in their results, especially for detecting subtle effects in the inner speech tasks. They chose this number based on a careful power analysis to ensure they could reliably detect even small differences. So, what did they find? This is the crucial question. Did inner speech, just thinking words in your head, reduce the influence of external sounds, just like silent mouth movements did? When they crunched the numbers, they found that indeed the Mann effect was significantly reduced when participants were engaged in inner speech. This reduction was strongest when the inner speech matched the external sound, similar to what Scott observed with silent speech. They also successfully replicated Scott's findings with silent speech, showing a reduction in the Mann effect when participants silently mouthed the words. This confirmed that their experimental setup was reliable. The key finding is that it is not just about moving your lips. The act of mentally simulating speech, your inner voice, appears to have a measurable impact on how you perceive external sounds. It is like your brain is so busy generating the sensory experience of speech internally that it dampens down the incoming sensory information. This provides strong evidence for the corollary discharge theory as the mechanism behind the rich sensory experience of inner speech. It suggests that our inner voice isn't just a disembodied whisper, but a sophisticated mental simulation that leverages the same predictive mechanisms as actual speech. Now, it is important to acknowledge that this is a complex area. The researchers used a specific type of auditory illusion, the Mann effect, to get at this. While their findings are compelling, especially the replication of Scott's work and the extension to true inner speech, there are always nuances. For example, the vividness of a participant's inner experience as measured by those questionnaires did play a role. Those who reported stronger inner speech or auditory imagery showed a more pronounced reduction in the Mann effect during the inner speech tasks. This makes intuitive sense if you can imagine the sound more clearly. Your brain simulation might be more effective. The statistical evidence shown by those base factors strongly supported the idea that inner speech does indeed influence perception in this way. They found robust evidence for the predicted reduction of the Mann effect during inner speech tasks. So, what is the big takeaway? This study beautifully demonstrates that your inner voice isn't just you thinking. It is an active process of mental simulation, likely using the brain's predictive mechanisms to create that auditory experience. It means that when you hear yourself talk in your head, your brain is doing something remarkably similar to what it does when you actually speak. By generating predicted sensory consequences, this research helps us understand the very fabric of our conscious experience and how our internal world is constructed. What is next? Well, future research could explore how these effects vary across different types of inner speech, like when we're planning an action versus just rehearsing information. They could also investigate how this relates to conditions where inner speech goes awry, like auditory verbal hallucinations. It is a fascinating peek into the machinery of the mind, showing just how connected our inner and outer worlds truly are. What do you think about this? Does it change how you think about your own inner voice? Let me know in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this deep dive into the mind, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to RUBIN'S Mind Lab for more, and ring that notification bell so you don't miss our next exploration into the amazing world of psychology. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next video.